We just heard Vladimir Zelensky saying you don't want a Minsk 3. There's a lot of dissatisfaction. Can you just summarize what the sentiments of Kyiv are right now?
Well, when they're talking about Minsk, we should perhaps remind viewers that this is a reference to the Minsk peace process, which basically maintained a shaky ceasefire between the Russian and Ukrainian forces between 2015 and 2022, when the full-scale invasion started. The view of that in Ukraine now is that it was a very unsatisfactory agreement. There were endless talks about putting in place some kind of political solution, with the Russians never really creating the conditions that would allow Ukraine to accept that, and constantly blaming the Ukrainians for blocking the process. At the moment, Ukraine's position is very strongly that it doesn't want that to happen again, and that it won't accept any kind of ceasefire that isn't a proper and just solution, which is actually what Olaf Scholz apparently called for when he spoke to Vladimir Putin. But of course, seen from Kyiv, it doesn't seem very credible when the German Chancellor is saying, on the one hand, that the Russians have got to withdraw all of their forces from Ukraine, and on the other hand, insisting that he will not change his position on allowing Ukraine to use, to have long-range Taurus missiles to fire against targets in Russia, which is one of the many things the Ukrainians say they absolutely need in order to turn the tide and force the Russians to leave. So the Ukrainians think that nothing really good can come out of this conversation from their point of view. Olaf Scholz doesn't appear very credible, but what it does do, as Volodymyr Zelensky said, is sort of normalize the idea of talking to Vladimir Putin, and perhaps the idea that he can be seen in some way as an equal partner in the quest for a diplomatic solution to this conflict. The Ukrainians, of course, don't want the world to see it that way. They want the world to keep in mind that this is an unprovoked war of aggression by Russia against Ukraine, and that the Russians need to be, isolated as much as possible on the world stage, and the Ukrainians need to be, treated absolutely in a completely different way than the Russians are. At least, though, Olaf Scholz did call Volodymyr Zelensky first before calling Vladimir Putin. In the past, the Ukrainians have been very offended about anybody going over their head in terms of talking with the Russians. And Volodymyr Zelensky had his opportunity to say publicly that he disapproved, and I think also to try to dissuade Olaf Scholz from doing it before the phone call even took place. But of course, the German Chancellor had already made up his mind. I wouldn't exaggerate too much, though, how miffed the Ukrainians are about this. I think they need to express their dissatisfaction publicly, but perhaps it's something that they were anyway expecting, because they know that the internal political context for Olaf Scholz in Germany is very, very difficult, and he's trying to sort of balance between parts of his electorate that want the Germans to restore better relations with Russia, and another part that want to see the Germans talking tougher with Vladimir Putin. Seems to me he's trying to ride two horses at the same time, and he won't get any benefit from it. And that's also what Ukrainians I spoke to this evening they dismissed it as Olaf Scholz's, kind of not very consequential attempts to solve his internal political problems more than anything else.
Gulliver, it's a bit of a difficult question, but I want to just put you on the spot and ask, do you think that Olaf Scholz is taking his lead maybe from Donald Trump, who was also recently on a phone call with Vladimir Putin?
Well, yes, and remember, the Ukrainians, although it was never really confirmed that that phone call actually took place, the Kremlin denied it, but the Ukrainians weren't up in arms about it. They didn't say that they didn't want Trump to speak to Putin. They said that they were expecting it. So maybe actually, I don't know if Olaf Scholz thinks that Donald Trump already normalized talking to the Kremlin, but I don't think so, really, because of this odd, Kremlin denial and Trump team refusal to confirm whether that conversation actually took place at all.
Thank you, Gulliver. Of course, we will keep an eye on it. Ukraine also just showing their worry, if you can say that, just about what it could mean under a Trump presidency. We will be talking about what his cabinet picks might determine for Ukraine's future. That's coming up later. Gulliver Cragg joining us from Kyiv, though, on that